Welcome to Scary Stories.
Welcome to our second Scary Stories NYC podcast. I'll be honest, when I checked the view total the day after posting the first episode, it looked to me like you guys didn't want a second episode. I wasn't sure I was even going to do a second one, and then I noticed that after a few days, people started to listen to the thing. And now it's been getting up over a couple thousand views, so I'm thinking out how to do this every Friday for you folks. Here on YouTube in our normal videos, we're in the middle of a 2-week Dogman and Werewolf story marathon with at least one new story per day. On the night before Halloween, the 30th, we've got our original 2016 narrator PQ River coming back for a return visit. For that reason, I've put together an extra long show featuring some of the really good Werewolf and Dogman stories that PQ River has already read for this show. Tonight we'll be highlighting some of his finest work from 5 years ago, in the far simpler times of 2018. But before we get to that, I'm going to read you an all-new email we got about a story that is alleged to have happened in the late 1970s or early 1980s to a woman driving her car long distance for business. If you're listening on YouTube, this is the story depicted in our thumbnail, and the lady who sent it in is calling it, "A friendly dogman pushed my car out of a ditch." Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a dogman story about a supersized monster that might have been a werewolf and not a dogman. I say that because he was so intelligent, and he helped a lady out of a real jam. I don't even know what I would have done if this hulking hairy bulldozer of a canine hadn't shown up when he did. I am 68 now, and this happened when I was in my mid-20s. Those were the dark ages for me, and there are 3.5 or 4 years that I only remember patches of. I wasn't on illegal narcotics or anything, but I was smoking too many cigarettes, drinking too many drinks, and working too hard at the same time. Back then, people would drink and do business at the same time. My grandchildren get taken out of the room when I started telling the truth about how civilization functioned for millennia before the politically correct age. But back then, I wasn't a crotchety old-timer yet. Back then, I was the dangerous newcomer, a woman striking out in business on her own. I didn't really want to be in that position, but my husband left me and I had to figure out how to support myself. So for that long-lost weekend period, I was sort of a traveling sales lady. I mean, I was exactly that, but I was also a person hired to charm clients. They would send me forth with a company budget to wine and dine men, it was still 80% or more men back then, and charm them into working with my bosses. It was an approach that some of our competitors felt was underhanded, and I was called all sorts of bad names. Some of the bad words hurled at me were accurate, though. I was a spy. I was a bad girl. I would do what I needed to in order to win a client over. And that was the era before I heard about AIDS, so I mean it quite literally. I would do anything necessary. And for me to act that way required an awful lot of drinking. And that's why it was a time that I'm happy to remember very little of. But this is one event from that era that I couldn't forget if I wanted to. This was the time I could have died, but a huge monster came out of nowhere and saved me. I was driving hungover from one client to another that I needed to be extra friendly to. My mind was clearly not on the road, as I suddenly realized I was on a dirt road, going through the woods. I didn't remember making any turnoff, but I was so distracted. I was never present in those days. I was sort of asleep even when I was awake, because life was too painful being alone and doing that job I had to do to survive. I felt so embarrassed to have got myself lost on a dirt road, and I felt terrified as well. I decided to try to turn back, but it wasn't going to be easy to make a U-turn with a stiff neck and a headache. I backed up off the path of ways, and I got my rear tires both stuck in some muddy, grassy ditch where I couldn't get any traction. And now I started panicking, because I didn't even know where I was. It was muddy. It was getting darker. And I didn't know what to do about any of this. I don't think I owned my first cell phone till a dozen or 15 years after this. And I didn't even remember how far back the paved road was, let alone a telephone to call for help. My heart was beating really fast, and I remember crying and praying. I felt ashamed to be praying. I didn't feel worthy to ask for help or guidance, and I said so in my prayers. Then something bumped my car from behind, and I tensed up. Things were still for a moment. Then I felt the car rushing forward and back onto the dirt road. I screamed like a lunatic until the car stopped moving. I was back facing the direction I was originally heading in. What had just happened? A dark shadow fell over the car, and the earth trembled as the largest land animal besides the elephant that I've ever seen walked up alongside of my car. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. It wasn't like sleep paralysis where you can't scream because your body's still asleep. This was like my brain wanted to scream, but my throat was too scared to make another sound. I looked out my car at this creature larger than a bear, and it seemed to be some sort of a dog, but also a man at the same time. Man isn't a good word, but person might be better. He had a personality. He wasn't just a creature. The big dog man ran out in front of my car and then back, then ran off again down the road, then back to me. It felt like he was telling me to drive forward. I didn't know what was in that direction, though. It could be his kill cave. Frustrated at my lack of movement, the dog man went behind my car and started pushing me forward through the mud with his strength alone. I took the car out of park and let him roll it down the dirt road, not having any idea if that was a good decision or not. It was this or stay back there in the mud, and so I kept my fingers crossed, and I sat there trying to stay calm. We came out of the forest and into a field of some sort, and I hit the brakes and beeped the horn to get the creature to stop. I don't know what came over me, but I jumped out of the car to look around. It was a very illogical thing to do. This creature was 4 times my size, but somehow I was more frightened about the fact that I was lost than of this giant impossible monster dogman. I looked back at the beast towering over my car. He was whimpering like a puppy. He wanted me to get back inside, and so I did. Then he pushed me into another patch of woods, and I said a prayer of apology for all the things I have done which were wrong or inconsiderate. I was sure I was being taken somewhere to be eaten. My mascara was running. It was a disaster. But when we came through those woods, there was a paved highway. I felt like celebrating. The car stopped moving forward, and I realized that the friendly dogman had already run off. I couldn't see him in any direction, but I said thank you to him in my head, and a prayer of thanks as well. And then I started the engine and went back to my hellhole of an existence. I won't say that this series of events led to me changing my life overnight, but I will say that it kept coming back to me. It kept nagging at me from the back of my mind. Eventually, that nagging helped me get out of that kind of work and to get some training to become a nurse. That allowed me to earn a living while feeling like I was doing something to help other people, not just allowing other people to help themselves to me. But I never would have survived to do that unless a friendly dogman pushed my car out of a ditch.
The Dogman Car Chase, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. I've got a story to tell you about a monster that might possibly be a dogman or a tulpa, or maybe both at the same time. This happened back in the 80s, and I was hanging with my buddies. It was right at the end of the summer, immediately before we all split up and went to college. American Werewolf in London had just come out, and we were driving home after having seen it down at the mall. My brother, Chino, not his real name, was driving. We were all talking excitedly over each other about the special effects and the monster in the film. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. I mean, we thought Lon Chaney Jr. was cool, so this absolutely blew our minds. It was a definite paradigm shift in terms of werewolf movies. We were describing visuals we were impressed by and retelling funny lines from the film when Chino interrupted us and asked us what that thing was alongside the road up ahead. We all stopped talking and stared. It was the American Werewolf in London, except in New Jersey. It looked like an oversized prehistoric wolf. It looked like the movie. It had a long snout, it had immense fangs, the works. We drove by looking at it, and it looked at us in return. Somebody asked if that was a tie-in with the movie or something. Then it ran after us on its hind legs. We screamed. Chino screamed louder. "What's it doing? What's happening?" he screeched in a voice 2 or 3 octaves higher than normal. We all shouted that the thing was chasing us, and Chino hit the gas. I was thinking that it must be publicity for the movie. There was no other logical interpretation. The guy won't be able to chase us once we get up to speed. That's when he dropped to all fours and got serious about running after us. All hell broke loose in that car as we freaked out, insisting Chino drive faster and faster. But no matter how fast he got the car to go, the huge wolf ran faster. I watched it as it ran like a greyhound, but bizarrely faster than any dog or wolf should be able to run. It was catching up with us. There was a huge and long right turn coming up ahead, and Chino didn't think he could make it at the speed we were going. Without any warning, he hit the brakes, and we started the long process of skidding to a halt. The dogman, who was nearly about to overtake us when Chino hit the brake, sped past us on the highway and tried to also put the brakes on. His claws dug into the highway pavement, and I swear I remember seeing sparks shoot out. He spun out over the grass partition between the 2 sides of the highway and skidded past it and back into traffic directly into the path of an oncoming 18-wheeler. We all gasped in horror at the accident about to happen, then gasped in surprise a second later as the werewolf creature arrested its momentum and gracefully avoided getting hit, easily making it to the woods on the far side and avoiding injury. We once again erupted in shouts at Chino to drive, which he did, and we never saw the creature again. So how did this happen? I used to read Robert Anton Wilson back then, so I chalked it up to the cosmic trickster. Later, I read about tulpas in a book by John A. Keel. That led me to think maybe our intense imagination all focused on the same exact image of the werewolf in the movie, briefly but vividly manifested the creature in the consensual reality of the early 1980s. I mean, I guess it's also possible there's actually a giant wolf that can run either on all fours or on its hind legs like a man, chasing cars through central New Jersey. It just seems more likely, to me personally, that something weird happened that night when we drove home from American Werewolf in London. I'll probably never know what the creature was that chased us that day, but in my gut, it was something different than a normal predator in the woods. To me, that was something that for a lack of a better term, I will call paranormal. Addendum. I told my brother Chino that I had written this story up to be read by you, and he gave me further information that sort of rips my theories all to shreds. He says that later that same year, around Christmas time, he saw the same or a very similar creature on that same highway, but maybe about 10 miles north of where we first saw it. He says this time it was on the opposite side of the highway, and he doesn't think it noticed him. I asked Chino if he had been thinking about the werewolf or dogs or anything like that before he saw it, like we were the first time. He said he was listening to the radio and thinking about how he wished he could date Cyndi Lauper. So I guess the wolf wasn't a tulpa, at least not that second time. I asked Chino why he never told me this story before, and he reminded me that I didn't come back home for Christmas that year. There was all this personal family stuff going on that I'd rather not get into, but anyway, we actually didn't see each other for over a year back then, so by the time we did get to hang out, I guess the second dogman sighting was old news. It certainly wasn't as memorable as the first one. I asked him if he could describe the creature in any detail, but all he remembered was that it looked to him the same as the first one we saw that chased us. So, who knows? Maybe all Chino saw was the dying reflection of the tulpa we had all generated that earlier day after seeing the movie. Or maybe an upright, walking, carnivorous canid really does walk the woods of New Jersey after all. Don't go away. We've got a story coming up about a cryptid so strange, we're hoping you can tell us what it is. I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279. The Dr. Smith Cryptid Encounter, or the Crow-Kata, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. If you've ever seen the old 1960s Lost in Space television program, then you remember the bumbling comic relief character Dr. Smith. He was cowardly, he was greedy, and he was always good for a few laughs. Not the pretty lady from the new version, not Gary Oldman. I mean the creepy old man Dr. Smith from TV, as played by Jonathan Harris. Now imagine, you're alone in a forest, in the dark, in the winter, lost and trying to find your way home. Then suddenly you hear the unmistakable voice of Dr. Smith calling your name. That happened to me, and trust me, it's something you don't ever want to hear. Comedy relief, out of context, can be really creepy. It was early 1968, I think, or 69. I was either 8 or 9 years old, and I guess my sister was 13 or 14. My father was employed at a factory. He would work through the holidays to make overtime pay. Then we'd take our Christmas vacation in either January or February, whenever he could get the days off. He'd always drive us up to our great-uncle's small house in the woods, which was quite different from Elmhurst, where we lived. This arrangement was fine as far as my sister and I were concerned. We'd get off school for the holidays, then Dad would take us out of classes to go off on another holiday in the woods that might last 2 weeks or longer. The teachers would give Mom our homework and assignments in advance, and she'd let us do it at our own pace. My sister would spend most of the first week studying and finish her homework early. Then she'd play the rest of the time there. Me, I'd save it all to the last 2 or 3 days. We both nearly always ended up with a B+ average, so our parents let us each do things our own unique way. About the only bad thing about our great-uncle's place was that there was very little TV reception. We could barely get one local station, and we couldn't watch my favorite show, Lost in Space. I was a red-headed kid named Will. Yes, that is my real name. And the show was about a red-headed kid also named Will, who went on adventures in outer space with a robot and the queer old duck I already mentioned named Dr. Smith. I love the robot, but each week I kept hoping that Dr. Smith would really get lost in space. He was a creep. In fact, he was the only reason they got lost in space in the first place, because he sabotaged their ship. He so obviously always made the wrong decision every time that even as a little kid you were screaming at the television, "No, Dr. Smith, no!" As an adult, I can see what a great comedic villain he was, but as a kid, I just found him frustrating. My sister, on the other hand, only watched the show to see Dr. Smith, who she thought was the star of the show. When we played Lost in Space at my great-uncle's house, she would always want to play Dr. Smith. She didn't want to play the robot, and she didn't want to play Judy or Penny. She wanted to play Dr. Smith. I was Will, of course. I had no choice but to play Will according to kid logic. So a typical game might start out with me as Will suggesting to my sister that we study the botany on this winter planet we'd landed the Jupiter 2 on. It was usually snowy around there when we would visit, so we called it the winter planet. Anyway, my sister, as Dr. Smith, would protest that she had a bad back and that I should go on ahead of her studying the local flora while she went inside and read a book by the fire. Then we'd have to argue for a while before she'd come with me. But she would be shouting, the pain," periodically along the way. It was very annoying. After a few days of it that year, I put my foot down and insisted she had to play someone other than Dr. Smith or I was going to quit. She called me a pusillanimous popinjay and mocked me, so I ran off into the woods, crying. I was angry, hurt, and feeling very sorry for myself, so I didn't really notice all the time that was passing or what direction I had been heading in. It dawned on me after a while that I was growing cold, and I was beginning to feel the first pangs of hunger. Looking about myself, I became alarmed that I noticed no landmarks, and nothing seemed at all familiar. The sun was nearly overhead, so I knew it was around noon, but I couldn't tell direction from that. I stopped and listened, and it was remarkably quiet in the way that only winter in nature can be. It took a while of just standing there, being as quiet as I could, and listening. But eventually I heard what I took to be the shushing of a car on the highway. I knew that road was east of the house, so I was beginning to get my bearings back and started walking in the general direction I figured the house would be. After what felt like 20 minutes or more, I realized I hadn't seen my own or anyone else's footprints in the snow for some time. I might be headed toward the house, or I might be heading off into the middle of nowhere. That's when I heard it.
"Will, oh dear heavens, where are you, my boy?"
It was my sister quietly calling me, or more precisely, it was my sister doing Dr. Smith calling me, sounding frightened and cowardly, the way he always sounded on television.
"Will, oh dear heavens, where are you, my boy?"
The same exact cry. With a great sense of relief, I headed in the direction of the voice as quietly as I could manage. I had hopes of catching up with her from behind and scaring her. That way, I'd get even with her for picking on me earlier. After a while, I stopped walking because I was no longer sure which direction the voice came from. Then the doctor spoke again.
pain, the pain.
Off I headed toward the latest utterance of the doctor.
Will, oh dear heavens, where are you, my boy?
He sounded closer now. I mean she. Seemed like she was just on the other side of that row of evergreens. I snuck up to the trees in my best late 60s ninja style. I could see that there was someone moving on the other side. Inspired, I reached down and quietly rolled a nice hard snowball to make the surprise even more surprising. It was all I could do to keep from giggling out loud when I leaned through the fir branches, gazing around, looking for my sister. I didn't see her. I did see this other thing. It was like a dog, a very, very large dog. It was striped like a Tasmanian tiger, but much larger, like the size of a Great Dane, or even bigger, but bulky and striped. My father told me that sometimes bear might be in the area and coyote. All I wanted right then was to be back inside, telling him that he had left giant striped wolf off the wildlife list. I dropped my snowball and walked as quickly and quietly as I could in a different direction. Now, I wasn't sure where I was headed, and there was a large predator in the area. I was crying, and the tears were freezing on my face. My breath froze to my upper lip, and my sweat froze in every part of my body. I was terrified. The only thing I could think of was my great-uncle's house, and how if I could get back there, I'd never go out again. I prayed that I was heading in the correct direction. Then I heard it, from back in the direction of the huge wolf thing.
Will, oh dear heavens, where are you, my boy?
It was the Dr. Smith voice. My idiot sister was still playing the game. She didn't get it that we were in danger. She must not have seen the monster dog. I shouted her name out at the top of my lungs. I raced back toward the large creature, knowing I might be putting my life at risk. I had to get back to her before that animal did. Then I heard my name again, but not in the Dr. Smith voice, in my sister's. Will, where are you, dimwit? And it was not coming from the direction I was running to, or the direction I was running from. It came from my left. There she was. I could see her off in the distance, and the house was right there behind her. I ran as fast as I could toward them until I had a sharp cramp in my side and had to rest before running some more. During my second rest, I looked behind me and saw the head of the beast emerging from the woods. I remember all pain disappearing, and I remember warming myself by the fire later on. Any other detail about what happened between those two moments has not been retained by my conscious memory. I'm the only one who saw the dog, but nobody acted like I was making the story up. My mother said we weren't allowed to play outside without her or Dad watching us anymore, but that was a moot point to me. I never wanted to be outside at that place ever again. After telling my story to everyone, it was my sister who first made the connection between the voice and the dog. She said it wasn't her doing Dr. Smith out there in the woods, so it must have been the dog. That totally freaked me out, that there could be dogs who imitated humans in the way a parrot does. Maybe it didn't know what it was saying, but it just liked the sound of what it was saying. Or maybe, and this is the idea that gives me the creeps about all this, maybe this dog animal imitates humans in order to draw one of us away from our pack or tribe. Once it gets us alone, maybe we're easier to hunt. Recently I was watching an old episode of a Lost in Space on TV, and I thought of this weird thing that happened to me as a kid. It's almost like the memory of a fever dream. Back then I had this feeling that eventually I would understand what had happened that winter, and it would all make sense. Now it's literally almost 60 years ago, and it's a bigger mystery to me than it was back then. I did an internet search to see if what I saw fits the profile of any known or mythological creature. And I did find out about something from Ethiopia called the crocata, or the korokata. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that. This is a large half-wolf and half-dog entity who can imitate the voices of humans in order to attract them before killing and eating them. I don't want to reveal exactly where my story took place, but it was definitely not in Ethiopia. It was in upstate New York. How a mythical Ethiopian dog could be wandering the winter forests of the northeastern United States, I could not guess. Maybe it was some other kind of giant wolf creature that imitates humans. All I know is this. If you're walking through the freezing dark winter woods alone and creepy old Dr. Smith calls your name, do not, and I repeat, do not, as in never, answer. The Winter of Our Dogman Tent, as told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. I grew up in a house with two sisters, but every winter my cousin Archie and his parents from the West Coast would visit. Then we would play Army, Kung Fu, Evel Knievel, or any of the other things my sister never wanted to play with me. One winter, in the later 70s, Arch and I saw repeated instances of what we called the WOLFMEN. I'm pretty sure it's what you all now call dogman. It all started one sunny day after it had snowed for 36 hours straight. My father and Archie's father both decided we were all going to have a snowball war. They started building fortifications, which amounted to a small, maybe 3 or 4 foot tall wall on either side to hide behind, while making snowballs to throw at the other side. They gave each other some time limit before the war began to create ammunition and defenses. After a while, we all started rooting for one side or the other, then helping out. Before you knew it, a real snowball fight had sprung out, and we all had a lot of fun and laughed really hard. My sisters gave up first and went inside to warm up, then both of our fathers, until only Archie and I were left, heaving snow at each other's heads. Soon, it was starting to get dark, and my mother called us in for dinner. Being kids, we told her we'd be inside in a few minutes and went back to the snowball war. After she called us a second time, we both saw it. It was a blur in the shape of a hairy demon, a Bigfoot kind of a thing, but angular, with a long snout and pointed ears. We each only saw it peripherally at first, but we described the same thing to each other. These days, there is a picture on the internet taken years after that, which is almost exactly what we saw. Back then, though, it was definitely like nothing either of us had ever seen before. It was an angry dog, but it was a man at the same time. We saw it for only a split second, but we got a definite idea of the direction in which it was headed. Our eyes scanned the trees in that direction, and then, for just another split second, we got a second look at the thing. We both got to stare directly at it as it ran from one patch of trees, over a bit of snowy meadow, and then into the deeper part of the forest and out of sight. It ran on its 2 hind legs as gracefully as a marathon runner. Somewhat less gracefully, and screaming at the top of our lungs, both Cousin Archie and I raced back to the house, weeping the entire way. Before we got back home, though, Archie caught up to me and got me to promise not to tell what we saw. I asked why. He said that if our parents knew what we saw, we wouldn't be allowed to play over by the forest anymore. I looked at him like he was crazy. Why would we want to play by the forest? We just saw a freaking werewolf over there, man. I really wanted to get inside where it was safe and warm so I could tell my mother what had happened. cousin Archie then explained his plan, which he had thought up just then for the both of us to camp out over by the forest with his new Kodak flash camera. When we heard the Wolfman, he would flash the camera and we would have proof that werewolves are real. So, I asked him, what good would it be to prove that werewolves are real? Arch said it would make us world famous and rich, and we'd probably get to go on TV with Dr. Spock on In Search Of. I thought about it. A real werewolf would be at least as cool as the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot turning out to be real. Maybe it actually would make us rich and famous. On the other hand, it might get us killed. Let's ask our moms if it's all right, I suggested, trying to push my way inside. No mother in history would say it's okay to camp in the snow waiting for Dogman, he countered, which, I have to admit, was a logical argument. I thought about it and realized that they probably wouldn't believe us anyway. We needed another reason to do it, a reason our fathers would get behind. Raccoons, Archie shouted. Our dads are always both lecturing us to take more of an interest in nature. Let's tell them we saw raccoons and we want to camp out at least part of the night and see if we can get any photos of them. Then they'll sell the idea to our moms for us. His plan worked out just fine. We were in 87 layers of thermal undergarments, winter sweaters, and coats crammed into sleeping bags and in our tent by the Dogman Forest within 2 hours of Arch having conceived the notion. Our mothers supplied us with large thermoses of hot chocolate, but no food, because they were terrified that the raccoons were going to beat us up to steal our snacks away. Our fathers had practically had to drag both of them back to the house. They were so opposed to the idea of us camping out in the snow to study intelligent creatures with opposable thumbs. Little did they know. Archie was as excited as I've ever seen him, but I was having some serious second thoughts. I told my cousin I no longer cared if I got on TV. I'd rather go inside and watch TV instead. He talked me into staying, insisting that if we don't see anything by midnight, we'd give up and go inside. Everything was quiet, and it was kind of exciting to be out at night away from parental control, so I decided to relax and take it all in, which I did. It was boring, and my nose was getting cold looking out the front of the tent. I pulled myself inside and decided to take a short nap. I have no idea how long I was out when Arch was waking me up roughly, shoving me in the shoulder and whispering something. His camera flashed and he reset it as fast as he could. Then he took a second and third shot with the flash going off each time. After the third one, I heard a terrible scream. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before in my life. Archie's Swiss Army knife was out, and he ripped a long tear in the tent, forcing his way through and running home. I still had not seen what was out there, but I had heard the scream, and Archie didn't have to suggest I join him in running. I did it quite voluntarily. After emerging from the tent, I looked over my shoulder, and there it was, standing right out in the open. It was taller than either of us, probably taller than my father. It was not a man in a costume unless somebody had applied all the fur or hair directly to his body. I know this because I could see things like his nipples and other privates through the fur. Whatever this thing was, it was not being faked in any way. When it stood there, it didn't stand like an ape or a chimp. It stood like a man, like a very large, impossibly muscular man who was absolutely furious for some reason. It had long, tall, pointed ears which twitched violently, and whiskers on the end of its long, growling snout that did the same. It was smelling us and smelling our fear. It looked me directly in the eye. Then it started moving towards us. I turned around and ran like I'd never run in my life. I didn't know how long the creature did or didn't pursue us, as I just never looked back. We made it inside, and I broke down into pathetic tears. Archie didn't laugh, though. He was pretty shaken up as well. While I blubbered deliriously, he told everyone that we saw some kind of large animal, but we couldn't tell what it was in the darkness. He told them he'd tried to take a picture of it 3 times, so maybe he caught something on camera. His father agreed to drive us to Photomat in the parking lot at the next town in the morning. Back then, I think we had to leave it overnight to get it developed. It was a different time back then, that's for sure. When we finally got the photos back, you could hardly see anything in them. The flash didn't extend far enough to really cast much light on the trees. In one of them, there's what might possibly be a blurry line of eyeshine traveling from right to left in the photo. But then again, it might not have been that at all. Without a clear view of the trees or anything else in the shot, there was no way to place anything in the proper context. It's possible that if we had modern tools like Photoshop, that we might be able to do something to study the images better, but my mother threw them out along with most of my childhood belongings when I later went off to college. So, we never did get any proof that there was really a werewolf in the woods behind our house, but at least we lived to tell the tale. The end. And now, without further ado, we present what might be the weirdest dogman story of all time. It's Raining Dogman. As told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. The strangest, most inexplicable, and most terrifying things that ever happened to me are all the same thing. Although the entire incident took maybe 30 seconds to 45 seconds to play out in its entirety, it takes me far longer to explain. What I am about to tell you is not only a dogman story, it's probably the strangest dogman story you will ever hear. I was out hiking alone on the Pacific Coast Trail in Lassen National Forest up in Northern California near Oregon. It's the kind of place that makes you feel like you're going to see Bigfoot. In fact, that's exactly what I was thinking when this all happened. I was thinking, this is probably where Sasquatch lives, if that's a real thing. A chill went through me, and I looked around. Every leaf seemed to be moving, thanks to the jolt I had given my imagination. Why was that tree shaking? Is it just the wind making that bush sway? Every sound was heightened, and none were louder than my beating heart. That's when I started to hear sounds above me in the tree cover. It was so far up that I made a mental note of it, but didn't really pay much attention. Something was very high in one of these trees. Maybe a bird, maybe 2 squirrels chasing each other. I didn't care. My attention was on the vegetation all around me, not above me. I had the strangest feeling, and I was interpreting it to mean that I was in the presence of Bigfoot. It was not the feeling that I was being watched, at least not exactly. It was more like I felt as though I were prey. A gentle breeze kept moving things and distracting me from the ever-present sound of branches and leaves being moved about above me, until an acorn hit me on the head. It was just an acorn, and although it hit me square on top of the head and hurt pretty badly, it was more the unexpected nature of it happening that freaked me out. That acorn almost gave me a heart attack. I spun around and around thinking someone had thrown a rock at me. Then a couple more acorns fell around me, narrowly missing me, and I realized what had happened. A huge sense of relief washed over me as I suddenly came into the realization that I had been imagining the entire thing. There was no Bigfoot stalking me. I nearly laughed, but then something loud went crack directly above me. A logical person would move away from the sound of something about to fall onto him. Me? I stood my ground and looked up, like an idiot. And it was all for naught, as I absolutely couldn't understand what I was seeing. It was like a large branch was falling directly onto me, but it was more than that. I swear that was my first impression. If that sounds too weird, maybe it was someone holding onto it as it fell, but honestly, it seemed like someone sort of surfing, or maybe skiing this branch down right on top of me. I'm not sure how much time I lost in amazement, but I did manage to move my body out of the way in the last few instants before it fell, whatever it was. I fell sideways, partially landing on a log. I knocked the wind out of myself, which was quite painful in the short term. There was dust everywhere and leaves in the air floating back down, making it hard to see. I desperately tried to inhale the dirty air into my lungs, and then I tried again. Finally, I got a breath or two, then proceeded to have a choking fit, leaving me dizzy. I was panting for oxygen and lying on my side when I finally saw it. I saw what had fallen on me. Now, you might have noticed that I'm telling you a story that makes no sense so far. I hope you don't mind if the next part doesn't make any sense either. The branch that had fallen had to be over a foot thick. If it had landed on me, I doubt I would have survived. But the thing that climbed up behind it, the thing that had surfed it down almost on top of me, was a dog. A dog. A dog that fell out of a tree. Okay, dogs don't go in trees. Cats go in trees. Snakes, maybe, not dogs. And this dog had not fallen from a low branch. This dog fell from a huge branch that had to have been at least 30 or 40 feet up there on this ancient tree. It was not a rotten branch. It was a large, healthy-looking branch. Don't ask me to explain how a branch that thick and that healthy broke off the tree, because I can't even imagine how that could have happened. Nothing I was looking at made sense, but I stopped wondering what was happening when the dog locked eyes with me. Now, I've looked into the eyes of a mountain lion, and I've looked into the eyes of a black bear. I'd far rather be eye to eye with either of those predators than this canine that was looking back at me. Its eyes were colored wrong. They were yellow and red and maybe black. The thing about them that grabbed me was the look, which was not like the look that the eyes of any other animal had. I almost want to say they had intelligence, but it wouldn't be the right word. They had anger in them, but to such a degree that the anger seemed to almost exist on its own, like a form of consciousness of its own design. Maybe that's what the word evil really means. I always laughed at that word, as it seems simple-minded and silly. What's evil to one person is good to the next. How could there be such a thing as absolute evil? There couldn't. Just like there couldn't possibly be a dog who fell from the sky, glaring at me with yellow eyes. The dog lifted its head to get a better look at me. Then it began to growl. It was the strangest growl I'd ever heard from a dog, like that of a beast much larger. And so, for those of you still with me, fasten your seatbelts. Here's where the story gets really insane. The dog stood up. Now up on all fours, he looked down at me. I carefully but quickly stood up, not wanting a predatory animal to feel it had a size advantage over me. Suddenly I realized that this had only brought me eye to eye with the animal. That didn't make sense, and I felt the world spin inside me counterclockwise. Dogs don't stand as tall as me on all fours. Not even big dogs. This impossible tree dog was impossibly as tall as me. I hope you're sitting down, because the next thing the dog did was it stood up. Yes, I know, it was already standing up, but now it continued to stand up. It stood on its hind legs and looked down at me. Utterly astonished, I just sort of looked at the thing. I don't mean looking in its eyes. I'd done enough of that already. I mean, I started finally scoping this thing out. It had dark brown or gray sort of hair, straight. Not long but not short. It had a long snout like a wolf or coyote or German shepherd, and pointed ears as well. Its teeth were much larger than a real dog's teeth. I don't know what this was, but it was not a dog in the normal sense. Maybe it was a prehistoric kind of a dog. Maybe this was a survivor from antiquity, or maybe this was a mutant. It definitely had a chest the size of the rocks, or maybe bigger, and arms to match. The front legs definitely seemed like arms when he stood up, not like front legs. I honestly don't remember what they had looked like before he stood up, but I remember that I didn't notice anything strange about him other than his size and eyes before he rose up and became bipedal. The hind legs were much thicker than a dog's legs normally would be. He had to be standing at least 3 feet taller than me, judging by how far back I remember craning my neck to look at him. I'm 6 feet tall, so do the math. Let's recap, shall we? I'm hiking through a beautiful forest in Northern California. I start thinking about Bigfoot and get paranoid. Then, a freaking werewolf rides a huge falling branch down, almost killing me. Now, I'm standing, looking up at a literally impossible monster. Just in case you didn't believe me the first time, yes, that's my story, and no, I'm not sure if I'm sane. All I know is I was standing up as high as I could just to see this creature's chin. And then, the next second, I was looking eye to eye with him again. Why? Because the giant wolfman thoughtfully bent over to lean directly in my face. He began sniffing me all around my face and hair. I froze and stood as still as I could manage. When he got to my neck, I saw my entire life from when I was very young, straight up to that moment in time. There were a number of people I regretted not saying goodbye to, but for the most part, I made peace with my life and prepared to move on to whatever comes next. Then, the dogman started licking my throat and my cheek. It tickled, and I let out a laugh. This was getting like mad monster party. I think what I mistook for playfulness was just him tasting me before deciding if he would eat me. So it turned out that laughing was a bad idea. This wolfman was a sensitive monster. He didn't like to be laughed at, and he let me know with a savage bark that was half scream. He lunged forward at me, and I collapsed to the ground in a quivering, whimpering mess. Any liquid that had once been inside me exited and was now pooling up around me. My body's organs were preparing to be torn apart and eaten, and I admit, I cried like an infant. He screamed. The dogman screamed. And then he ran away. Just like that. I saw this thing run away on all fours so quickly that it seemed like a special effect. It was a big ooh effect. I could practically hear the audience in the IMAX theater wearing their 3D glasses, oohing and eyeing at what I had just witnessed. But this was real. At least I think it was real. Or a very vivid hallucination, at least. Dogs, don't jump down 40 feet out of trees. Dogs don't stand over 9 feet tall on their hind legs. And besides all this, dogs are pack animals. Thank God this one wasn't. But basically, what I'm trying to say here is none of this is something that could possibly have ever happened. Maybe it didn't. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was somehow broadcast into my brain. Maybe I got too close to a secret military installation and they scrambled my head to scare me away from the area. And if this really did happen, was the creature trying to land on me when it came down out of the tree? Had the branch broken accidentally, or had the creature broken the limb off deliberately? Was this an accidental occurrence, or was this an attack on me? If so, then why did the creature run away after it had me in its clutches? It was 3 feet taller than me and fast. It could have killed me and eaten me without extending much effort, so why didn't it? And if the branch broke off accidentally, how did it break? It was a thick, heavy branch. Besides, what was this creature doing way up in a tree in the first place? Did it climb up there? Did it drop there out of a UFO? At this point, I'm open to even the weirdest suggestions. I can't really explain anything about this story, so your guess is as good as mine. All I know is, even though I stayed in a heightened state of alarm, the rest of my hike was utterly normal. I never saw anything like this ever again. If you can tell me what happened to me, I'd be delighted to learn. I might be the only person who ever came face to face with Dogman who still isn't sure if Dogman really exists. Grandma Meets a Werewolf is told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ Ribber. My grandmother was in vaudeville back when she was a kid and a teenager. She performed with her parents as a family act. They never rose high in the billing, and by the time she had grown up, the act wasn't getting booked at all anymore. She married an insurance salesman over harsh protests from her parents, and she settled down to raise my mom and then to be the grandma that I knew. Every once in a while, she would pull out an old show business story. The time either Wheeler or Woolsey made a pass at her, the time Chico Marx asked her for a loan and Harpo wanted her not to do it. But my favorite of her vaudeville stories didn't have much to do with show business at all. That's because my favorite story Grandma used to tell was the story of the time in 1916 when she claimed she saw an actual werewolf. When Grandma first started performing, she was only 5 years old. She would do comedy and play percussion when her parents sang. As she got older, the act became more and more about her. The family were often asked to come to dinner and stay over with well-to-do individuals who had seen them perform. It was always much better than the seedy hotels they stayed in when they could afford to stay inside at all, so they always accepted. Because Grandma was a cute kid, people naturally wanted to take care of her, and her parents capitalized on that. As Grandma grew into her teen years, however, they found out that not only did the act not work as well, but they got invited to dinner by the audience members far less often. When they did get asked to socialize, by that point, it was mostly creepy guys looking to get her alone. One night, soon after Grandma's 16th birthday, this guy seemed like a gentleman, invited her dad and mom to dinner at his place, and said the family could stay over. All went well through dinner, but sure enough, he snuck into her bedroom that night and tried to get handsy. Grandma says she screamed for her parents, and the guy got really mad. He threw them and their luggage out of the house with the three of them still in their sleeping clothes. They got dressed as well as they could right there in front of the man's house, then began the long walk back to the train station. Her father wanted to sleep in the station and get the first train to the next town they were booked to perform in. Her mother wanted them to get a room in the hotel near the station. Their quarreling got increasingly heated, but the night got colder and colder. They had been walking on a dirt road near the edge of a forest. Now Grandma noticed that the forest was still there, but she still wasn't sure in the darkness where the road had gone. Her parents were too busy saying hurtful things to each other to have noticed that they might not be heading in the right direction any longer. She told me this story 3 different times, and the facts were slightly different each version. I would guess I was there for the retelling of this story in 1971, 1972, and either 73 or 74. She died in 1975 at the age of 75, which was old back then. Her memory at the end might have been a little off, and my own memory may be playing tricks on me when I remember this, but in every version of the story, the next thing that happens is she looks towards the woods, and right there, in the first row of trees, she sees an incredibly large, hairy man with the head of a feral dog. She gasped and hid behind her father, who immediately got out the pistol he carried for self-defense. He began shouting toward the forest, and my grandmother realized that her father thought it was a guy from back at the house where they had dinner. She tried to explain to him that it was something else, something larger and more terrifying than that guy. Her father called to the woods angrily, demanding that whoever was there show himself. This was the last thing my grandmother wanted to happen. She pulled her father and mother's clothes, trying to get them to leave that area. Grandma said that they could see a shadow in the trees, and she thought it was going to come out and show itself, as her father had commanded. Instead, it howled. Grandma says her father and mother both went pale when they realized that she was right, and it was not a man at all pursuing them, but a giant carnivorous beast. They tried to move away toward the station as quickly as they could, but they were all carrying luggage, and women wore a lot more clothes back in those days. It was this whole thing. So the going was not very fast. Grandma told us she knew what it wanted was her. She also realized that if a beast that large and savage wanted her, it could have her, and there was nothing her parents could do about it. She was going to have to depend on luck, or the dogman deciding not to take her for whatever reason. They still had over an hour of walking to get to the train station or any kind of civilization at all. Just then, a voice called out to them from their right. Squinting in that direction, she could make out light from lamps. They quickly headed in that direction and realized the calls were coming from an old man who was driving a wooden cart with his horse. He said he saw they had wandered off the road and wanted to warn them to steer clear of those woods at night. He told them that lots of folks wander off the road at night and are never heard from again. Grandma says she begged the man to give them a lift to the train station, but he had just come from that direction and had no need to go back till the next day. Finally, they offered him the amount they would have paid to stay at the hotel to carry them to safety, and he agreed. The 3 of them rode in the wooden cart in the back, watching the road behind them. Grandma said the moon was setting behind the trees and it was getting darker and harder to see. After a while, though, she started to hear sounds which seemed to indicate that they were perhaps being followed. It was all on one side, to her right, the side she'd seen the dogman on. Grandma called to the driver to please drive faster. He argued that he was going as fast as he was getting paid to go, but he was interrupted by a loud growl coming from the darkness.
Yes, ma'am, I'll drive her faster.
They held on tight as the speeding cart bumped up and down and side to side all over the dirt and stone road. Grandma says that as loud as the horse and cart got, she could still hear the thing following them in the woods. And then she saw it. They all saw it. Brazenly running right down the center of the road behind them was the hairy, dog-headed man she had seen earlier. You could see him for a second in the dim light provided by the lamps. Then he'd disappear back into the darkness, only to emerge again as he gained on them. He was even taller than Grandma had realized earlier. She said he was an insane, feral caveman with a dog head. I remember asking her why she called it a caveman. Did it wear clothes? She said, no. Did it have long hair, like a caveman? She said no, it had dog-length hair, whatever she meant by that. Grandma seemed to feel that this was something prehistoric, and it had the basic body shape of a man. So I guess to her, that meant it was a caveman or proto-human. So where was I? Oh, right. The dogman was now openly running after their cart. She could see it had dark gray fur, darker and lighter in various areas, and that its eyes glowed like they were lit by candles. Even when it would fall back into darkness, you could still see the eye shine for a while after the body was completely in darkness. The monster snarled and snapped at them, making it very clear its intentions toward them were of the worst kind. Grandma said it had claws on its fingers and toes, but seemed like a furry man other than that, and the head. It ran like a man, on 2 legs. She said it never dropped to 4 legs. It was walking or running bipedally throughout the entire incident. One time she told us it had no tail. The next time she said she thought it might have had one. I think I forgot to ask about the tail the last time she told the story. It seems she mainly saw it from the front, and for that reason, I'm not sure she would have seen the tail much, whether it was there or not. So there it is. A werewolf or dogman. It's gaining on them, getting closer and closer to their cart, and it has such a look of hatred on its face that Grandma said it was all she could do to keep from fainting. She's screaming at the guy to drive the horse faster. All of Grandma's family is screaming at the guy to go faster. Her mom and dad and probably all her dead ancestors too. The theoretical idea of me was probably screaming at this guy too. After all, if Grandma got taken by a dogman, I wouldn't ever get to be born. So, in the cart, Grandma now saw the lights of the train station. The dogman did as well, and it ceased its chase, allowing them to rejoin their own kind. Grandma said it just melted back into the darkness as they approached civilization, and that was the last she ever saw it, or heard of it, or anything like it. I asked Grandma if this turned her off to show business or to accepting invitations from the audience. She said back in her day you didn't have the option of being turned off to something. Life was hard. If you had a traumatic experience in the woods, you went back out there the next day as though nothing had happened. If a member of the audience turned out to be a psycho, you were just as friendly to the next audience the next night. There was no other option. It was about survival. Didn't you know, she asked me, I met your grandfather when he was an audience member after one of my last shows. Now that is the real story of why I quit show business, not the werewolf story. The werewolf encounter was just another night in vaudeville. Trust me. Grandma might have preferred to put on a brave face about it, but she wouldn't have retold the story so many times if it hadn't been a shocking and memorable occurrence, as opposed to just another night in vaudeville. She was a tough old lady, but even my grandma would have been no match against the savagery of a feral dogman. an entire pack of dogman. As told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. I'm fascinated by stories of dogmen because of this thing that happened to me when I was young that I'm about to tell you. But in almost all the stories, the dogman acts alone. The one and only time I saw a dogman, I think I saw 11 of them all at once. This is the story of that night. Okay, I was around 11, I guess. It was summer, New Jersey, 1970s. Hot, sweaty, boring. The internet hadn't been invented yet, etc. I was hanging with a buddy of mine, getting in trouble out at the edge of Chatham, and we ended up wandering, possibly illegally, into the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. We loved it in there. It was like going back to the age of the dinosaurs. We saw weird birds and insects in there and joked around that Tyrannosaurus Rex and cavemen lived further into the park. Anyway, this one time we were in there, we stayed after it had started to get dark. We hadn't ever done that before, but we really had no sense of the possible dangers that exist after dark for two completely unprepared teenagers in a wildlife refuge. As it turns out, they call it wildlife for a reason. So anyway, my buddy and I are hanging out at a rock behind some trees on the edge of this grassy area that has a wall at one end, just a plain, nondescript wall. I can't tell what's on the other side. I'm not sure if it's a wall of a building or just a wall in the woods. I didn't think twice about it, but then I thought I saw some guy go over, lean on the wall, and light up a cigarette. I say I thought I saw this because I just noticed it peripherally. I was mainly talking to my friend and not paying attention to the wall beyond it. But I remember seeing the smoking guy because it made me think. That wall must be part of a business, and there's an employee taking a smoking break. It helped me define the odd wall, and that's why I remembered it. So then, after a while, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see a bear or a Bigfoot walk over to the cigarette-smoking guy. That immediately draws my attention, and I look directly at the scene. I motion for my buddy to be quiet and look as well. When I squint, I can see that it's not a bear, and it's not a Bigfoot. It's not a man either. It's a dog walking on its hind legs. At first I thought this meant it was a dog doing a trick, and I relaxed, thinking the mystery had been explained. But then my gaze drifted over to the cigarette-smoking fellow, and I saw that he was wearing a dog head mask. That really freaked me out, and I gasped loudly. I was afraid they heard me, so I ducked down behind the rock. We both did. Now we were facing away from the scene, and we were both thoroughly freaked out. I asked my buddy what kind of a nut job wears a dog mask in the woods. My buddy didn't think it was a mask. I started looking at him like he was on drugs or something, but he was shaking all over, and he was convinced we were looking at either werewolves or maybe native shamans or shapeshifters. We sat there silently, and I considered what he had said. Then, slowly, quietly, stealthily, I turned around to face the scene across the meadow again, and I took a peek. The smoking man was now joined by a few more standing dogs. I realize now that the man was not wearing clothes, and that he was, in fact, one of the standing dogs himself. I had thought he was wearing dark clothes, but that was his fur. This was a scene of madness and horror. I whispered to my friend, "What do we do?" He whispered back, Let's watch them. And so, that's what we did. I'm not sure how long we were there, but it must have been something like 60 or 90 minutes. One by one, more dogmen arrived. They seemed to be separating into groups and having quiet conversations among themselves, although there were also one or two who I remember standing alone by themselves. This just continued and continued as the night came on, and the sky grew darker and darker and darker. There must have been 10 or 12 of them there by that point. And then, all at once, without any warning whatsoever, every one of those dogmen or werewolves or brujos or whatever they were ran off in a different direction. At lightning speed they erupted in all directions. Several of them were heading in our direction. I only remember running after that. I remember running like nothing else existed, like the only reason I was born was to run. I did not see my life flashing in front of my eyes. I was not going to die that day. I ran over, under, around, and through every part of that forest until we reached the edge of the wild area and escaped back to the land of the humans. I never looked back, and we were both lucky enough to have never seen those dogmen ever again. A couple or 3 days later, I was in a newsstand store in town, and there was a new comic book on the stands with a werewolf on the cover. We were both talking about where the artist got it right and where he got it wrong. One of the old guys in the store was laughing at us, this Native American guy. He asked why we thought we knew what real werewolves looked like. Being kids, we just told him. We saw them lining up by the wall in the woods before they went off to hunt. The old Native American guy stopped laughing at us, and he got this weird expression on his face. Finally, he told us that his father always said that the wall in the woods was a gathering place for bad spirits. He just assumed his father was going mental when he said stuff like that, but our story was sort of freaking him out. So, anyway, fast forward to the summer of 2014. My buddy and I decided on Facebook we would meet and try to relocate that old wall in the woods and take pictures of it. During the day this time. We're not as brave as we once were. Okay, so we met and we entered the forest, this time with GPS to help guide our way to where we thought the wall was. Short version of the story is that we never found that wall or even that meadow or pasture in our entire day of searching. Either we were looking in the wrong place or the wall's been taken down. It's possible we walked past the site several times without recognizing it, and it's also possible that we never got close to it. So really, all that I've got in the end is a story. I saw a gathering of dog-headed men at dusk. I saw them disperse. I don't know why either of these things happened or what any of it means. The only thing I know is that dogmen do have a social structure and they do communicate with each other. And that's the true story of the only time I ever saw Dogman.
And now I'd like to end by thanking our channel members and PayPal Club members. First of all, we have to thank Godzilla Tim, who I will be thanking more formally in our Saturday night show this week. This man has joined twice to our channel membership, and he gave us £5 British just last night on top of that. So yeah, we will be thanking Godzilla Tim again tomorrow. We also want to thank Kathy Barrickman, of course, as we always do. That having been said, we love all of our channel members, and we are only still online because of the support of each and every one of you guys. I'm going to read out these randomly as they come up. All of these people are just as important to the channel as the others, and we love you all equally. In random order, thank you to Efren Kolunga, Mary Shabazz, Fraggy Dendron aka Magera, James Fleming, Nancy Sears, Matthew Frederick, Ace Williams, who's also joined twice like Godzilla Tim, Inocencio de Divas, Anna White, Deborah Darcy, Julie Sadler, Ron Barracuda, who has been joined to our channel membership the longest. Blue Cruz, Super Spark, Victor O, Helena 66, Esteban P, Angie K, Roy Faulkner, Stel Cordova, Michelle Rich, Adam Friday, Hagridella, Jim Mooney, Deborah Areola, Scott Fuller, Chris Nihis, Stacy Miller, Tiffany Walsh, Melissa Kutch, John Smith, Dave Rabbit, Victor Collado, Fuzzy Lou, The Ender Werewolf, The Zoomancer, Michael A. Bell, Linda Hagler, Sarah Jones, James Tucker, Nicholas Carroll, Todd Graves, Mr. Spinks, Patricia Taggart, Franco Albi. What was that with 3 question marks? Valerie Gomez, aka Nicole Gomez. Long Island Bigfoot, who just signed up for 7 months of memberships. Scott Halisic, Johnny Pasillas, Justin Simon, Anthony Johnson, and a special thank you and message for Jeff Kennedy. We keep getting PayPal payments from you, but your email no longer exists, so we have no way to send you the links to our members-only shows. I hope you're okay. If you're still with us and you hear this message, please connect a different email to your PayPal, or else please contact me with a different way I can send you the links. I hope all is well with you and with everyone still listening this late into the show. Please let me know if you'd like me to continue this podcast and try to make it a series, or if you think it's just a Halloween thing that we should drop in November. Please come back tomorrow on YouTube and Rumble, when we will have a new story about a friendly dogman. Hope to see you then, and happy Halloween.